嗨，大家好，非常欢迎各位呢来收看我们在线上为各位呢播出的文创永动机文创投资趋势国际论坛。今天这个论坛呢，我们会进行一整天，而且会有四个场次的专题的讲座，然后有与谈人一起参与，然后最后呢会有一个圆桌论坛。我们非常希望能够透过今天这个活动，能够让文创跟投资这两个不同的概念呢，怎么样结合起来？但是最重要的是，我们还是希望能够把影响力投资这个概念呢，能够在台湾能够来推动。今天我们为各位呢，请到两位贵宾哈。那第一位的主讲者呢，他是来自于欧洲的Figurative 的执行董事Francesca Sanderson。我们先跟各位介绍一下
，Hello。
好，第二位呢是我们国内非常熟悉的，大家很熟悉的文化创意的一位学者任教于东吴大学的刘维公刘教授。刘教授你好。
局长好，各位观众大家好。
好，维公呢也是我们台北市文化局前任的这个局长所以他其实对于文创文化的行政工作呢也非常的熟悉。那再加上在学界的任教，所以我们待会呢也会请他一起来参与那个语谈人。那关于这个我们今天的贵宾这个Sanderson 的一些相关资料呢，我们其实有跟各位给各位准备。简单讲呢，他长期的工作让他对于所谓的投资非常的专业，但是在文化艺术特别像包括表演艺术这些不同领域的这个艺术的领域，有没有可能成为投资的一个标的，而不是只是单纯的所谓的补助？那所谓的影响力投资，这个影响力的概念是什么？那影响力投资的概念跟一般的所谓的商业投资的概念差别又在哪里？所以我们待会会请这个Fran 呢做40分钟的专题演讲，然后之后结束以后，我们再请维公教授呢一起来发表他的一个站在台湾的角度怎么样来做一个互动。我们现在就请这个Fran 来发表他40分钟的一个专题的演讲。
Thank you. 你好。I'm here to talk about our experience with impact investments in the cultural and creative sector in the UK. So Figurative, my organisation, is an independent, not-for-profit, dedicated to impact, investment and innovation in the culture and creative sector. I'm here more to talk about investment today. Figurative incorporates arts and culture finance, which was incubated in Nesta from 2015 to 2024, and New Philanthropy for Arts and Culture, which was established by a major philanthropist in the UK in 2019. The Arts and Culture Finance Initiative provides repayable finance, also known as social investment, to cultural and creative organisations that have a clear social benefit. A bit of context. So the UK cultural and creative sector, cultural organisations are responsible for their own financial decisions, and they can be for-profit or not-for-profit. Most of the organisations that Figurative has invested in are not-for-profit, constituted as charities. Organisations can generate income through trading, which is usually ticket sales, but can be other lines of trading, rents and licensing on the properties that they own or lease, and fundraising, especially not-for-profits. And this tends to be from the government, the central government, local municipalities, which is shrinking very significantly, trusts and foundations, so big charitable trusts, and high net worth individuals or patrons. So the opportunity, this is a traditionally grant-funded sector, but it does have commercial capabilities. The sector is delivering significant social benefits to communities and society and individuals through things like health and well-being, education. It's facing increasing competition for funding from corporates, from individuals and from the public sector. It's inherently creative, imaginative, and entrepreneurial. But there are structural challenges around risk-taking and innovation. It's difficult to have a culture of innovation in a publicly funded organization that has a decreasing risk appetite. So what is impact investment? First, I'll say, what is repayable finance? Simply, it's a form of funding that you have to pay back. So in contrast to a grant. And what is social or impact investment? Social or impact investment is the provision of finance for a social as well as a financial return. Often, not always, the investor will take a discounted return to allow for the social return of the investment of their capital. It can be used to fund new activities, scale up existing activities, to buy property, to bridge to fundraising. So if you need to do a capital project, for example, you can fundraise after you've started the project, or simply to manage cash. And what is blended finance? Another term I'll use. That's a combination of grant and loan funding, for example, from public, philanthropic, and private sources. This often happens at the organization level, but we're talking about blending at the financial vehicle level. Now, how can impact investment be used? It can be used for anything, and really that's up to the intermediary. It is a very flexible funding mechanism. It might be used for paying staff, for new product line development or management, for buying new equipment, for renovations to an existing property, or for buying property. In fact, any kind of business line development, as long as you can see a business model. And what do social impact investment managers like ourselves look for in an investee organization? We look for a good business plan, strong financial management, high quality leadership, and a clear social impact case. It's important to note here that the social impact case doesn't have to be directly connected to the project that we're funding. Sometimes we will look at what we call a cross-subsidy case. So for example, we might fund something purely commercial, like a restaurant or a bar in an organization, but we will look at the social impact that's generated elsewhere in that organization. So they might be working with population of disadvantaged children nearby, for example, and the restaurant will help to fund that work. Now, what does impact investment promise for the sector? It's a new source of funding, so it may bring in additional capital that looks for different things. It's flexible, so in general, our loans will be more patient and more affordable than a commercial loan. And in most cases, the organizations we fund would not qualify for a commercial loan because they're too risky. The banks don't understand the sector well enough, and the banks do not value the social outcomes. It may be faster than public funding. In the UK, public funding tends to move in rigid cycles, so it cannot be very responsive to project needs. And it may be able to take more risk. A few data points on the UK impact investment market. So this grew to 76.8 billion in assets under management as of the end of 2023. A small aside, the market is still working out how to define impact investment, and different organizations will use different definitions. So be wary that some numbers will not be directly comparable. but this displayed 10.1% compound annual growth rate from the beginning of 2021 until the end of 2023. It's worth noting that this is in a higher interest rate environment, so more challenging to raise money into impact funds over this period. That compares to a 14% compound annual growth rate from the global impact investing market, looking at a report released by the Global Impact Investing Network, or the GIN, over the weekend. Impact investing growth has significantly outpaced the broader UK asset management sector. This means that investors are allocating more of their money towards impact, but it still accounts for just under 1% of the whole UK investing market. So that means it has significant potential to grow. UK-based impact investors support impactful companies, projects, and assets domestically and globally. And you'll see that the majority of those investments are, in fact, overseas. 2/3 of managers plan to increase or at least sustain their allocation of capital towards impact in the next 5 years. And the UK impact investing market accounts for approximately 8% of the global impact investing market. So you'll see that implies a £1 trillion market in assets under management. And the UK has been an early leader in impact investing, so it is somewhat overrepresented. So what are our key takeaways from doing impact investment in the arts? We think it makes money go further. So I'm about to explain how our funds work. The catalytic grants that are put into the funds can leverage in other money which might not otherwise have gone towards the arts sector, whilst also being potentially repayable. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. There is also the opportunity for recycling if this money is repayable, which means reinvesting repaid capital. It's very important to note that this is another tool in the toolkit. It is not a panacea, and it's not a replacement for grant funding. We see all the time organizations and projects which need grant funding and cannot take investment capital. Our mission is more about looking at an organization and seeing within that which projects might be suitable for investment funding rather than grant funding, and doing the same across the sector as a whole. And critically, this needs to work for the sector. This is key to Figurative being set up as independent and not-for-profit, so we can truly be credibly positioned to work for the sector that we serve. And investors must understand the sector needs and meet organizations where they are. A little bit about Arts and Culture Finance, the lender that we have brought from Nesta into Figurative. So we started, and I joined Nesta for the launch of the Arts Impact Fund in 2015. This was an interesting pilot, and I'll give a bit of background about how it came together. Arts Council England is an arm's length public funder. So it is a separate part of the government, a government agency funding the arts in England, primarily through what is called its national portfolio, and it funds national portfolio organisations every 3 or 4 years. Arts Council England was faced with a static or shrinking amount of money from the government. Its money comes direct from government as a grant and aid, and also from our national lottery. With the lottery money, there is a bit more flexibility about how it can be used. And the Arts Council started to look at some of the organizations they were funding with grants and some of the projects, and seeing that potentially these could be investments. This would make the money that the Arts Council has go further. However, the Arts Council itself was not set up to make loans to organizations, either constitutionally, and it was also considered challenging that the Arts Council be the primary grant funder and a lender due to the potential for conflicts of interest. So the Arts Council was interested in what vehicle might be set up that could help organizations take loans rather than grants for potentially commercial projects. Nesta, my former organization, was an innovation agency, is an innovation agency, also set up as an arm's length body, but spun out as an independent charity in 2012. At the time, Nesta had a strategic priority to support innovation, research analysis and policy, and investment in the arts and culture sector, and had published a piece of research by my former colleague, Dr. Hassan Bakshi, called The New Art of Finance, which investigated what these new models might be from a theoretical perspective. Nesta also has an endowment and was interested in using some of those endowment assets to support its charitable aims. This is called program-related investment. Esme Fairbairn is a very significant independent trust and foundation set up by the founder of M&G Investments. So it's originally a fortune from financial services. And they had a social investment arm and were trying to make loans into the arts and culture sector. But they saw very few deals. And they wondered if having an intermediary that was specifically set up to face the arts and culture sector might be helpful. The UK government, the Cabinet Office, was very interested in promoting models that blended public, philanthropic, and private capital in order to make each of those work harder. They introduced this steering group to Bank of America, who are a big arts funder in the UK and who do Community Development Finance Institute lending in the US. So they have a pot of money that, according to the Community Reinvestment Act in the US, must be invested in community development finance initiatives. So these parties were put together, and over the course of a long negotiation, of which I was a part, we made an agreement as to how the fund structure would work. So the Arts Council England put in their grant money, and that was a first loss or catalytic tranche. So the grant fund would protect the other investors in the fund and allow them to have a lower risk investment. Nesta and Esme Fairbairn then made what we call a mezzanine loan to the fund, protected by the Arts Council England's money. So they would not receive any losses until the Arts Council England money had been lost. Bank of America made a senior loan that was fully protected by that whole 5 million. So Bank of America, it was very, very difficult to imagine them losing any money. This launched in 2015. We had £7 million to invest. We closed investment in 2018, having made £9 million of investment, thanks to the recycling of capital. And all of those investors are on track to get their money back ahead of schedule. Well, they will get more back than expected. It is behind schedule because of the pandemic. Bank of America has been fully repaid. In 2018, seeing demand for smaller loans, I should have said that the Arts Impact Fund made between £150,000 and £600,000 loans to organisations. The rationale behind that was the cost of the team at Nesta extending the loans, which at that time was myself and one other person, and making sure that that cost didn't eat into that capital too much. However, we saw some appetite for smaller loans, and we raised money from Access Foundation from National Lottery Communities Fund and Big Society Capital through Access Foundation to make smaller loans. This was a less successful project because a lot of the demand we saw for loans was not actually realizable. A lot of those organizations weren't investable, so we struggled to deploy the capital. That taught us that the smaller end of the loan market is very difficult to service, even with subsidized economics, as that fund structure gave us. In 2020, faced with the closure of the Arts Impact Fund, we raised a follow-on fund, the Arts and Culture Impact Fund. So we had all 4 of our original investors and 3 additional investors. And this time we had £5 million of grant and £18 million of investment. So you can see how the scale helps the grant money, the public money, leverage in much more private investment. And again, that is due to the economics of the operating cost. So here we have the comparisons of our funds. You could just have a look. I've covered some of that already. An interesting thing to note is the forecast losses. So we have 13% losses forecast in the Arts Impact Fund. I will talk through some of those bad investments later. In the Cultural Impact Development Fund, which was designed to be higher risk, it is higher at 20%. And all of these are in line with our projections. For the Arts and Culture Impact Fund, it's a bit newer. We currently forecast 7% losses. It's much lower than that at the moment. And this is just looking at where impact investment sits in the broader ESG universe. So where responsible investment might be avoiding harm and sustainable investment might be benefiting, impact investment is genuinely contributing to positive outcomes and often can be lower return, as discussed, because it requires more subsidy. Here are a few of our portfolio organizations. You can see all of these on our website if you want to visit them. But this just shows a bit of the breadth. So we have a portfolio across art forms. There's museums there, music, theatre, creative workspace, ballet, and we also have a range of organizations from small to very significant and a range of loan purposes. So people have borrowed the money for different things. It is worth mentioning that a lot of them have been property related, and we think in part that is due to the difficulty of developing new ideas within the arts infrastructure and the current funding regime, which is why we would like to focus on innovation support in order to eventually make more diverse portfolios in terms of the projects that are funded. So you can see all of our case studies available on the website. So what are the advantages for an organization? The availability of capital. So if we suddenly come to the market with a £23 million fund, that is money that wasn't previously there. I like to think that that enables and incentivizes organizations to think about what their assets are and how they can raise money to invest in them for their future resilience. We have a flexible approach. And this relates to my earlier point about being for the sector. So we will talk to organizations, we will sometimes help them directly or signpost them to other agents and sometimes fund that for support in developing their business or impact models. On impact, because we're interested in social outcomes and values alignment, and when we present a potential idea to our investment committee, we will have to explain the social impact of that idea. So we work closely with organizations, asking them what they will look for to know that their social programs are being successful. So we will work with them to develop a theory of change and an outcomes framework, and we will measure them against these indicators that we have identified together. This funding may be cheaper in a rising interest rate environment. We have fixed costs into our funds, and so we have kept our costs out to the sector the same. And it may lead to improved financial resilience. Now, of course, this is the hypothesis, but we need to test this. Our Chief Investment Officer, Rachel, before she joined the team, did her master's thesis on the financial resilience of the portfolio. Now, the metrics she used was somewhat compromised by the pandemic and the funding that came through from the public sector, very generous funding from the Culture Recovery Fund, from the government. But there is a cautious conclusion that taking on a loan has led to improved financial resilience within our portfolio organizations. What are the risks for an organization of taking on this kind of funding? So defaulting on your repayment obligations might lead to insolvency and wind up. And we have a variety of cases, again, which I'll talk through, of what has happened in the cases where organizations have been unable to make their loan repayments. There's a time commitment of due diligence and also reporting once an investment has been made. And this does take resource and may take resources away from core work in a sector that is very capacity constrained at the moment. We do work with our organizations quite intensively ahead of making an investment, and we present a very thorough application and analysis of the risks to our investment committee. There are also balance sheet implications in a sector with lots of intangible assets that don't tend to be valued on their balance sheet. Taking on a debt could move a borrower into a net liability position, and this can be a challenge for additional funding. So a couple of case studies so you can understand the kind of projects we fund. Soho Theatre is a new work and stand-up comedy venue in the heart of central London. It's very well known and it has good audiences. What we like about this example is that they started to look at their assets and they realized that one of their assets was the network of successful comedians that felt very loyal to Soho Theatre because they had had an early break, or it might have been their first performance in London. And so what they wanted to do was create a comedy series for broadcast, but they wanted to self-produce this series rather than simply being a provider for a streamer. So we lent them the money to self-produce their comedy series, which meant that they had creative control and they owned the intellectual property, and therefore they were in a much stronger bargaining position when they started to talk to streamers about how it might be broadcast. In addition, they've now developed their own online platform and so can sell this content directly to audiences. We really like this example because of how imaginative it is about what assets are. The loan was repaid ahead of schedule, and they made a second series from their own reserves. You can watch this content. I'm not sure about in Taiwan, but hopefully it's available on Amazon Prime. This is the player that's on their own website. Music venue properties is also an interesting example. In the UK, we have a big problem with grassroots music venues closing. So Oasis recently announced their new tour, and somebody did the analysis, and I think 1/3 of the venues that they played in their original tour, I think it was Supersonic in the early 90s, are still open. So with this, we see that there is a real problem in the ecosystem of music development. This is mainly due to rising property prices in the UK. So for the owner of a property, there will be better economic advantages to different business models. And so many music venues which don't own their property have lost their leases. It's also a very challenging business model with rising costs, particularly around energy and general inflation. So Music Venues Trust saw this challenge, and they started to think about how they could address it. They have started another charity called Music Venues Properties, which will raise money to purchase properties already occupied by grassroots music venues and enable them to have a landlord relationship with a stable, charitable entity that cares about the impact. So we lent them money to support their first few purchases, which will assist in their future fundraising. So they have a similar structure where they have a charitable structure. They will hold assets in the structure, and they will raise commercial or impact capital into that structure. They now have 3 properties. So there's an update to this slide, which you can see on our website. And another exciting development is that Coldplay has recently pledged to give some of their proceeds from their recently announced world tour to Music Venues Properties. So a really interesting model of scale where you can understand the problem, and the problem can be solved by imaginatively structured capital. Pink College, another interesting example. One of the reasons I talk about this one is that when we talk about impact models, as I highlighted earlier in the slide around cross-subsidy, is that often the social work that an organization does will be a net cost to the bottom line of the organization. So usually there is not an income stream associated with that work. What Pink College had done, an extraordinary entrepreneur called Lisa, is identified a challenge in the education sector and started to work with pupils who have challenges in a traditional school environment, create provisions for them, educational provisions within arts and culture venues, and thereby dramatically increase their educational outcomes. Now, this works in 2 ways. Not only does Lisa have an income stream from the Department for Education because they pay for these students, but also the arts organizations get paid rent by Pink College for housing the students. So for us, this is a rare example where the financial performance of an investee is inherently linked to the social outcomes. Friends of the Pipe Factory is a more standard investment for us, and it also connects into heritage buildings. So this is an organization in Glasgow who saw an opportunity to revitalize a heritage building, a bit like the Bay 2 Museum that I saw yesterday. So this organization is currently in fundraising phase. The story is better if you see the picture. So here is the building. It's in quite a deprived area in Glasgow. And what the Friends of the Pipe Factory borrowed money from us for is, again, to renovate one phase of the building so they could use that to demonstrate the ability to run the whole building and fundraise for the completion of the project. And they've now raised the full amount, which is £2.5 million to renovate this. This will be artists' workshops, performance spaces, and community spaces with lots of community initiatives happening there. In addition, of course, this greatly increases the attractiveness of the area. So from a civic point of view, this is a good example of how you can do culture-led regeneration for an area which has been economically challenged and disadvantaged. Now, I said I would talk about some that failed. Autograph Media was an early investment for us. Autograph is a charitable gallery that prioritizes the work of minority ethnic artists and photographers. And what they wanted to do was set up an online platform that directly licensed their images to audiences and purchasers, rather than having to sell through a third-party platform and lose some of their profits. Put bluntly, this did not work because they didn't have the marketing know-how to get the volume of customers that they needed to get through their platform. In this case, we invested in the subsidiary, Autograph Media, rather than into the parent charity. So when Autograph Media failed, which was quite quickly, and we learned lessons from our due diligence because we didn't really know how to assess the risks. What happened was the trading subsidiary wound up, we lost all of our money, but the parent company and the charity continues. So there was no threat to the social impact in this case. What are our learnings? So number one learning is just that the impact investment market is big and growing, and the cultural and creative sector should really be participating in this development market. What are the challenges? So persistent low levels of awareness. We do have difficulty generating pipeline and meeting organizations who want to borrow from us. We haven't yet broken through to private capital and high net worth individuals, but we hope that our merger with New Philanthropy for Arts and Culture will help with that. We have some regulatory concerns, thinking about how we become a regulated financial entity, particularly as a low capitalized charity as we scale. And more recently, there has been a much tougher operating environment for arts and culture. But we think investees are feeling the benefits through their improved financial resilience, through stronger social impact monitoring and evaluation capability, and through increased access to other funding. And we have lots of anecdotal cases where that has happened, either through the fact that they've got through our due diligence process or their better evidence on their social outcomes and their better financial rigor. Awareness raising is key. A big project for us is raising awareness for the sector of this opportunity, explaining how flexible it can be and what the non-financial benefits are. And the very important takeaway, everything takes time. So it takes a long time for an organization to get funding. And the project for us is very long term. So we have been doing this for 9 years, and we still think in terms of the mindset shift. So our 3 biggest challenges, one of them I've alluded to earlier, and that is that there's a lack of research and development funding to experiment or to de-risk new ideas. This limits the diversity of case studies. So it means that when we talk to new investors to raise new funds, we are not telling the whole story of the potential of the cultural and creative sector. So we need to create a funding ecosystem that supports entrepreneurs within the cultural and creative sector right from the idea stage to scale. And alongside this, we need a mindset shift. So publicly funded organizations have rarely been enabled or incentivized to invest in their own assets. And this is a long-term transformation of thinking within organizations to understand what their assets are, what the upside could be, and why they might be worth investing in. And this is a huge project within organizations, both from the top management, from charity boards who are by definition risk averse, from executive teams who are challenged with minimal resources, down to supporting people with new ideas, particularly lower in the organization. And then the third challenge, and this is our challenge all the time, is managing expectations for investors on what the trade-off might be between the commercial and the social or artistic returns. Now, this trade-off doesn't always exist, but it sometimes does, and making sure we're clear about where investors should be taking a discount for the clear returns they're making in terms of social or artistic benefits, and where they can expect commercial returns. And I think making sure that we avoid reductive outcomes metrics, and we avoid a simplistic picture of the benefits that the cultural and creative sector can deliver is really critical, because it's a very special sector and the outcomes are spread very broadly.
Okay, thank you. 好，我们非常谢谢 Fran 的很精彩的演讲啊。但是我比较好奇的是说，因为毕竟 Fran 刚才的整个演讲是用欧洲、英国做一个大的背景，那到底适不适用于全世界，或者是适不适用于台湾？我也比较好奇。我可不可以先请教，让 Fran 来先回答一个问题？
好吧。
当你在提这些构想的时候 ，Fran， 你觉得对台湾来讲，它可以适用吗？这整个的经验跟 model。
I think there are commonalities with arts and culture organizations globally. So the direct relationship with audiences, the ability to trade, and the mixed economy model, usually. So in most places, there is some mix of public funding, trading income, philanthropic donations. Of course, in the US, philanthropy is huge. In most places, it's much smaller. But I think there is this opportunity to think about which are the models that have commercial applications. and where within the sector and within organizations there are investable opportunities. And a friend of mine in the UK says, with enough grant in any structure, you can make it work. So there will be an amount of grant that would make an investment structure's economics work. And if that enables additional money to come into the sector, then that's helpful. I do think everywhere where the arts are and need to be continually subsidized, that investment may not be appropriate. Some art forms are very expensive. Opera, orchestra, they're expensive for good reasons because we should pay the artists. And it's very difficult to make commercial models work. But people need to preserve these art forms for our cultural heritage. So of course they aren't necessarily investable models. Now within that, an orchestra may have an investable idea, whether that's using their catalogue or it's you know, an immersive tech project that allows you to experience sitting inside the orchestra, or developments in spatial audio. So there may be some orchestras that have investable projects, but that doesn't change the underlying economics, which is that it's hard to make a commercial proposition from an orchestra.
好，维公这样听了40分钟的演讲，跟刚才 Frank 的一个补充的说明，你表达一下你的看法吗？
我觉得非常，我觉得最后那一页就是我们让他讲完那一页，就是那个 big challenge， 那个大的挑战。我觉得那个事实上是其实有点间接，或者事实上也直接回答你的问题，就是说到底这些欧洲的或全球的，就等一下我要演讲就分享的那个内容，就是到台湾到底适不适用？我觉得他的那个后面的那个3个那个大的挑战，比如说 mindset。OK， 然后那你必须要告诉投资者，像刚才英国的案例，我们看到它的投资报酬率，我们看到在1到3%，1%到3%里面。那可是其实投资者常常在台湾常常会想要更多，然后再来就是说，他其实我觉得最喜欢的是他那一句话 ，everything take time， 就它是一个需要的一个时间，他花了9年的时间，他们还在做。这个大概就是我可以很快的讲，而且我非常喜欢英国的案例。那因为他们真的很扎实的在很多事情在上面，他们的商业概念成熟，然后他们的那个 impact 的 investment， 他们事实上还不断的在成长，10%的成长。那而且它虽然只占他们1%，所有的那个 social impact 那个 investment 只占1%，可他刚才我想 Frank 讲得很清楚，他会不断的在成长。所以这个大概就是台湾，我觉得应该我觉得在局里面就是文化局，台北市文化局算，我真的觉得应该是全台湾最先，我觉得在局长这样子的愿意这样投入的状况下面，我觉得这件事情是对的。英国的案例绝对可以值得来效仿。
好，里面你有准备一个资料，对不对？我们让那个刘维公刘教授来表达一下。
好，大概20分钟左右 ，OK。好，对，那首先大概先感谢局里面的邀请，就是让我来针对一个大概20分左右的一个分享。那刚才听了 Frank 的一个说明的时候，我真的觉得实际上这真的是符合我对英国案例的一个期待。那我今天他们其实特别想要表达的，事实上是台北有台北的模式。那这个是大概Frank 刚才没有提到，其实为什么他们那个整个计划会受这么瞩目的原因，是因为在2021年联合国宣布的就是它是那个所谓的国际创意经济的永续发展年。对，那事实上Frank 他们当时也在主导这个，大家可以看得到荧幕上面的就有3个单位，那其中他们是一个。那这个非常重要的原因是因为在他们最后做了一本非常棒的一本报告书，然后总共大概100篇文章。 然后我这边在荧幕上面特别写，就是摘录了那个马友友，因为在整个那个报告书里面的最后一个，大概就是马友友的那一个。然后它上面写了一句话，其实我们文化人跟创业人一直都在做，我们一直都在做对人类文明发展上面非常大的贡献的事情。那事实上我们现在需要的是更多的资源更多的 resources， 更多的那个 investment， 然后让更多的创意的文化的艺术家有这样的一个。那就像刚才局长在介绍我的时候，蔡局长在介绍我的时候也提到，就是我做过政务官。那我真的想要透过这个场合，其实积极的呼吁一下，就是说我们真的需要重新去 reshaping OK 那个所谓的创意或者文化政策，好，这非常 general 来说的是文化政策，真的要重新去定义它，或者重新去思考它。那上面荧幕上各位观众可以看得到，就是说你可以看到他们在谈的就是as a global public good， 就是说它事实上是一个不要，我真的必须要谈这个概念，主要的原因是因为其实对我来说 ，impact investment 就是什么叫做影响力投资。我给一个非常简单的一个答案，就是为你把资源、把经费、把一些资金，那投资在于愿意为地球和后代子孙负责任的这一些创意事业。OK， 当然你可以讲就是说，因为在就文化创意产业，那既然叫产业，当然是要for商业嘛，它当然就是要有利润，它等等之类的。那可是在，极端气候，在这一种所谓的贫富差距，然后民主政治，或者是这一种所谓的各式各样的社会冲突的时候，那我觉得文化创意工作者他不能置身于外，这也是联合国为什么宣布2021年它是一个所谓的永续发展年，对创意经济。所以我想，这个是一个非常值得被认真思考的一个课题在哪里边。那我不知道，观众知不知道，就是说，事实上在2022年，台湾的文化创意产业达到1兆的产值，营业额好，不要讲产值哈，营业额好。那这个是一个可能因为我事实上是在2002年就开始做文化创意产业的政策，那时候有所谓的挑战2008的国家政策，然后那时候在讲2兆双星，可是所谓的2兆双星，事实上是没有文化创意产业。谈那1兆产值的，事实上不是文化创意产业，可是2002年到现在，反而是文化创意产业它达到了这个历史的新高。但问题来了，就是说，就像我刚才讲的，就是说我们还是要这么样的去专注那所谓的产值嘛。那长官们也好，决策者也好，一定都要只是看到那个所谓的营业额，然后看到所谓的各式各样的这些数字嘛。那就像文策院，那他们现在在去年政府推了一个叫做所谓的4年100亿的内容的产制的这个部分，也就是说，这个整个台湾的文化创意产业的政策上面，甚至文化政策上面，其实它还是着重在 content， 它不是着重在像英国像 Frank 他们在介绍的，它着重在 impact 上面。所以从 content 变成 impact 这件事情，我真的觉得台湾需要做。那台北市事实上大家都知道是全台湾最重要的文化创意产业的推动的城市。那我想这是目前局里面还在积极在推的。从我们那时候其实更早在永平那时候就已经在推这个，我想这个是局里面的业务的一直在推这一些所谓的产业扶持等等之类的。那你看我们的产值，事实上我想局长你也可以看得到，就是我们在2022年的时候，那成长13.8%。然后那是6000多亿的这样的一个营收。那对我来说，这一些都不是在接下来我们要进入到所谓的这个所谓的影响力投资的时候的一个必要条件。因为对我来说，其实我真的要讲，事实上台北是投入到这个社会。这个所谓的影响力投资是有它非常好的一个条件，因为这是长期以来台北市的艺术文化工作者我想可能要跟各位观众介绍一下我的背景。事实上，我在还没当局长之前，事实上我曾经加入一个组织，就是中华民国环境艺术文化改造协会。那时候它是华山艺文，那时候不是华山文创园区，是华山的艺文特区的时候。那我们事实上就是在对于整个一些所谓的社会议题上面，那我们都不断的在去就台北市的这些艺术文化工作者，他其实都有强烈的这种所谓的使命感或者投入。那当我们到了这个，就是我在2012年郝龙斌时代的时候，我去接文化局长的时候，我们做了这个世界设计之都。其实当时我们就已经可以看得到了，就是说这事实上是世界设计之都的一个传统，就是一个 legacy 在。 因为我们当时到现在就是会把文化艺术创意当作是一个 solution。那这是我们当时做了很多有趣的、有意义的这一些 project。那这个 project 当然就是说，比如说我们去针对公园，我们针对这种闲置的空间，我们针对老房子，我们针对很多的事情，然后我们去做了这一些事情。所以各位观众一定要了解，所谓影响力投资不是一个完全新的概念，好像就是说突然台北市在这样做，其实不是，因为过去我们做的社会设计，也就是世界设计制度所倡议的概念。然后那在2014年的时候，事实上我们也也就是加入到这一种全球的一个行列，那个行列就是社会创新 （social innovation）， 我们都在做这些事情。所以影响力投资或者是所谓的影响力这个课题，并不是一个全新的。台北市事实上是有它的条件。那这一边当然就开始就是有点像是我今天分享的主题，就是说那这一个叫做所谓的我们自己有自己的 model， 就是刚才我们看到英国的。那我自己在两年前，大概2、3年，其实更早，我们大概我就自己有一个非常清楚的一个念头，就想要把这样的一个概念放进到我在工作的领域里面去。那这慢慢的，在去年的时候跟今年的时候，我开始注意到，我们可以做这件事情。所以说我接下来想要让各位观众，或者是让局里面的让市场让 friend 了解，台北市场正在做他自己的方式，正在操作中。这是我在7月的时候办了一个论坛。那我自己觉得台北在推这个所谓的影响力投资，那或者所谓的影响力这样子的一个推动的时候，它必须要着重在一件事情，我称为叫好事事业。那为什么叫好事事业？其实这 friend 觉得一定不陌生，这个是英国的这些案例们。那观众在看荧幕的时候，你会看当然因为时间有限，我没办法一个一个的介绍。其实我想要让各位了解，这一些都是刚才 friend 所提到的。那他们在投资的时候，他们找的这一些都是有一些是针对一些所谓的社会议题，比如说孤独的社会议题、失智者的社会议题，或者是教育的议题，或者是刚才讲的闲置空间，或者是这一些等等之类的。然后他们投入了很多的这一方面的这样的一个经费。然后刚才Frank 特别提到的是 Arts Culture Finance 这一个，那他们刚才他事实上已经稍微提到，他们大概就是这个领域，就是说比如说你现在资金短缺，你需要经费，然后那他给你，然后你需要去购买新的所谓的资产，那他也可以。那所有的他答应你的原因就是说你有一个 purpose， 你有一个想要做好事的，你想要做对的事情的这样子的一个出发点。然后不是因为你单纯只是因为你执行长想要赚更多的钱，或者是你的事业单位想要赚更多的利润，不是，而是在于就是说你做的事情是对于整体的城市发展、社区的发展、社会的发展、地球的发展有一个很好的贡献。那这就是我在这一些案例里面，就是不管是前面这一些案例，后面这一些案例，就是英国现在正在做的事情里面，我突然我看到了一个非常重要的一个操作的一个模式，那个模式就是在于你要找到好事事业。也就是说，今天不是单纯就是说你今天要做影响力投资，那我们就找一大堆的金主，或者找一大堆的所谓的那个投资单位，然后用道德劝说跟你讲，就是说，你要来帮忙等等之类。其实不是。那现在整个在国外的影响力投资，我的观察是在它有一个非常重要的一个发展的一个条件，或者是一个趋势。那个趋势在于就是说，那我称它叫为所谓的好事事业。好事事业我不知道怎么翻啊，在英文怎么翻？那当然你可以翻成叫 better business， 或者是所谓的 purpose business。那这在全世界，我觉得，但台湾我把它翻成好事情，因为真的就把它翻成使命感事业，太文言文了，对，很难被吸收。那我就把它翻成好事。可是重点是什么？其实它就是一个使命感，是所谓的 purpose led， 就是它其实是由使命感所主导的一个事业。所以它今天我们在这里面看到的，就是等一下会介绍，就是我正在做的事情。也就是说，我现在目前所谓的台北的模式是在于，就是说我有点像是一个，就是其实就像刚才 Frank 有提到，他必须要有一个中介者。他必须要有一些人，他必须要扮演的一些角色，就是找到那一些值得被看到的案例，值得被看到的人，然后告诉这些投资者，告诉社会大众，那这一些单位、这些组织、这一些事业值得被投资，或值得被用影响力投资的方式去投资。所以我所谓的好事事业，那就是这个概念。然后我们在7月的时候，我们找了一些我的好朋友， 然后让大家知道其实就是这样的一个东西。然后，而且我必须要再透过这一个场合想要让局里面了解，甚至让观众更多了解，其实在英国他们在做的事情，并不是单纯他是艺术团队、文化团队、创意团队，然后政府就给他钱，或者民间这些所谓的fund就给他钱。事实上，他们有投入更多的，我称它叫做新领域。那这些新领域叫做所谓的艺术保健 （Arts and Health）。然后还有一个叫但我想现在最近耳熟能详就是 DEI（Diversity, Equity 跟 Inclusion）。还有我非常喜欢在欧洲的有一个我非常喜欢的一个一个新的一个做法叫做 Cultural Commons， 那我称它叫文化共赢。那另外一个我真的要让观众了解，就是说其实影响力投资重点不是在算那些报酬，重点是在于你要引进一些新的概念，就是 Impact Report。那你必须要有一些新的概念，就是 purpose governance 等等之类的，所以说这一些都在我们现在想要去倡导。那因为时间上面的关系，我只举一个我现在比较积极想要让台湾尤其是艺术家、文化人、创意人，然后积极投入到一个领域，就是 arts and health。那这个主要的原因大家可以看到，这是一个全球的趋势，2040年那将近会有就是超过每4个人里面就有1个人是超过65岁。然后67人居住在都市里面，居住在都市里面，其实可以想象一下，各位你可以看到的荧幕上面所写的，就是16兆美元的这样的一个经济的损失，因为心理疾病的课题。然后到2040年，那极端气候的课题会非常严重。所以这一种所谓的 arts and health 的概念，或者是 health and well-being 这个概念，其实是应该我们积极投入。这也是英国现在他们正在做的，就是他把艺术当作解方，当作处方。那这是英国的一个非常重要的一个报告书，对我来说，那我想Frank 应该不陌生，这个是英国非常重要，因为我非常喜欢这个报告书，主要的原因就像刚才Frank 有提到，就是我们对 RMD 就是在 social 这个 impact 部分或 impact investment 我们缺乏一些所谓的研究。然后往往呢，就是大家只知道就投钱，可是市场有很多 insight 我们很缺乏。像这个报告书，就是大家可以看得到，就是说有更多的资料可以做证明，就是在于政府投入到这些艺术家们实际上是对的。那尤其像大家观众在看荧幕上面的右下角的时候，你可以看的左下角的时候，你可以看到79%，将你参加一些活动的是艺术活动的时候，他会动得更健康，吃得更健康。然后它有更强烈的这一种所谓 well-being 的这样子的一个感受在那边。那这就是我在7月办的一个论坛，然后就是我想要让更多人了解到，就是台湾其实是有一些人。那这个当然是第一个这个案例是在新北市，因为刚好我在新北市有个计划。那这一个乐淘淘他愿意捐出来。那就像我们在国外常看到的一些所谓的 purpose business， 所谓的好事事业，他会捐出5%、10%去做一些事情。那这一个就是陶瓷的第2代，他们会捐出一些5%的钱，然后去做2%的钱，他会去做这一个所谓的流浪猫、流浪狗的这样的一个救援。那这是我想可能在艺术界里面大家耳熟能详的胡朝胜。那这个部分真的要就是让 Friend 了解，就是在台湾也有类似这样的一个单位，他们就是说他们注意到了艺术家，然后他们事实上就尤其在心理课题上面非常的严肃。那就将近有一半的艺术家，他必须要服安眠药才能入睡，他必须要去接受心理的这咨商。所以呢，朝胜他这边就是说，他希望每一年可以捐出一笔钱来。然后去倡议，让政府也好，让更多人也好，去了解到艺术家的这个所谓的职业伤害。然后这是另外一位好朋友，那各位可以看到荧幕上面的左下角，这就是我讲的所谓的影响力报告。那重点我今天要去投这一些银行也好，政府也好，要去投你这一个单位，你必须要有能力告诉社会大众，告诉消费者，告诉所有的利害关系人。那你必须要在你的结案的时候，不是只是交一个结案报告书，然后就算了。你必须要让更多人知道你做的事情，你的 outcome。其实我非常在意这个所谓的 social outcomes， 就它最后的这个结果事实上是有效的。那所以影响力报告书为什么重要的原因，是因为这件事情才可以让更多人，它会持续的。尤其是刚才 Frank 特别提到，我非常喜欢的就是 financial 那个所谓的财务上的韧性。resilience 这个韧性这个概念，财务的韧性，其实通常影响力投资是非常重要。那这另外一个就是 The One， 他一直在从事职人的这一种，尤其在农业上面、小农食材上面的，他希望透过这样让消费成为一种影响力。然后这是另外一位也是认识好几十年的朋友了，就是阿寡，他们在做的是影响力投资。 那他在基隆，他现在已经将近有3000多个 social design 的案例在那里面。然后这个是华山，那这个是因为当时我是跟就是华山是我负责规划的，然后那时候得标的团队王龙文董事长他们就是最近这一段时间跟他们互动，然后他们现在支持我，然后就是每一段时间大概每4个月我们会办一次好事论坛。那这一边观众其实要注意到了，我特别要强调叫新出版。就是现在这个就是我想接下来，因为明年是远流的50年，所以说我们会针对出版这件事情，然后因为它是一个现在目前面临非常大的一个发展上的一个挑战，那我们想要做一个所谓的新出版的一个尝试在那里面，然后我们会把出版当作是一个处方prescription， 然后把它针对透过读书会，然后去影响然后能够帮社区跟地方做更多的事情，这是我们现在想要去做的。然后我们认为这有很多的新物种会出现在这里面。台湾好基金会它在潮州，那它是一个我觉得是最好的基础教材，因为他们在地方做的事情是非常非常精彩的事情。那我们需要让更多人了解到，你到偏乡，你到，或者是不要讲偏乡，家乡，那你回到家乡去做一些事情的时候，你一定会觉得，那你需要一些人陪伴，你需要知道一些 know how。那台湾好正在做这些事情，这些都是我想的，像风潮音乐，那各位可能都还停留在它是新世纪的音乐，或者是这些所谓的部落的这一些原住民的音乐。可是风潮音乐它现在做的更多的是儿童教育的、亲子教育，然后它做的更多的是身心灵的这种线上课程。然后这一些那都是杨景聪，那他回到他的初衷，他就是希望让大家有那种 well-being 的感觉。然后这个事实上是当时因为刚好我现在目前是嘉义市的那个城市展的顾问，所以我就把嘉义市的一些案例带进来。那像这是林聪明，那他的那个他事实上是一个他是2代经营，非常非常的有 power。然后他做了很多很多的这一种地方的贡献，他自己比如说他开那个所谓的直播，然后帮在地的一些比较小的这一些店家卖产品卖东西，然后他也投入到 Netflix 的摄影等等之类的，非常非常精彩。那这个是嘉义，是因为我们现在在帮他们，希望明年要办一个城市展，所以我们希望让更多人看到。那 purpose 跟城市的治理，就跟像当年我们在推世界设计之都，我们希望 design 跟所谓的 urban 的governance 能够做结合。那现在我们想要用 purpose 来去推一个概念，然后让大家知道，那城市的治理其实怎么样跟 purpose 做一个结合。那最后的这一个所谓的一个案例是我非常喜欢的，刚刚好就是也是下礼拜要启动的，就是产地开放的在莺歌。那这一些2代。那其实不好说出他是4代的，第4代的。那这一对夫妻，那他们希望能够在50岁的时候，那他希望他到50岁的时候，他的小孩愿意留在莺歌，而不是来到大的城市，台北市或者是高雄，离开家乡去工作。所以这个就是我们想要让观众了解，或者是我想 Fran 也好，全世界有这么多人在推所谓的 impact investment。其实就是希望有更多的事业，它要能够为地球负责任，为下一个世代负责任。那我们的目前的文化政策里面，就像我刚才提到的，就是我们太着重在于产值，我们太着重在于市场规模。那往往会认为你有更多的产品，你有更多的市占率，然后你有更多的所谓的国家队，它就是一个好的政策。那我希望能就简单来讲，其实是能不能冷静下来，认真的思考文化艺术创意本身。本质上面，它有一个非常重要的一个使命感，那个使命感其实才是当时为什么政府也好，社会也好，他认为他是有点像刚才 Fran 讲，就是我们有那个责任要去支持艺术家、文化人、创意人，那就是因为他们事实上是一个美好世界的一个解方或者是处方。那所以说我称台湾的文化创意经济，它有3波，第一波就是2002年，那这一波把美学价值摆到最高位，把美学的体验摆到最高位。那这是过去台湾传统制造业、科技业所没有的一个概念。第2波当然就是所谓的100亿的这个所谓的国发基金的投入，然后到所谓的文创院的一个成立，那他对 content、他对 IP 的重视，那这是第2波。第3波，那现在已经起来了。但我觉得在整个中央，虽然它有这样的一个经管会的一个政策，它开始重视到 impact， 它开始重视到 engagement。可是，在政策上面，我真的必须要讲，没有台北市目前正在推的这一个政策上面来的直接。 因为我们认为我们知道这件事情是重要的事情。所以我这边大概这个是大概在去年的时候，那我去参加那视觉艺术改造协会视觉艺术协会他们办，那他们在去年年底的时候，我们一群人聚在一起在花莲，然后我们在思考的是说台湾需要什么样的文化政策，因为我想观众应该知道，去年我们面对了总统的选举，然后我们需要这一些所谓的更好的文化政策。当时我们在谈很多的一些方向的时候，那视觉艺术工作者非常明显，那就是希望那政府不管是哪一党的候选人能够回到这件事情上面，注意到其实当这个世界需要改变的时候，你需要一个变革的力量的时候，其实我们这一些人，那事实上就这样，刚才我一开始提到马友友那一句话，其实我们正在做这些事情，所以我们可以大声的跟政府说，应该投资在艺术上。那这是我在当时后来它变成一个专刊里面我写的刚才那一句话。最后这张投影片，事实上就是我现在正在做的。那我希望就是更多人去看到的是要投资好事投资。那投资好事投资，简单来说就是找对的事业，就是我们要把你的资源或者政府的资源也好，民间的经费也好，投入到那现在想要做对的事情、好的事情的这一些事业里，所以叫做投资好事。可是呢，投资它其实分成好几种类型，大家都知道，你可以非常商业的，或者是就像矽谷一样，就像这一种华尔街一样，他想要做到的是那一种所谓的独角兽，市值10亿美金的独角兽。那这类投资真的不是 social impact 或者是 impact investment 他想要发展的方向。那所以说，找对的投资，做对的投资，就是所谓的好事投资，就是一种新的形态的投资类型，应该要在台湾被积极被看到。那最后再一次感谢局里面的邀请，然后我也非常开心能够看到 Fran， 因为必须要讲一直都在看他们的研究报告，然后终于现在看到本尊，然后刚才看到他很多非常详细的资料。我觉得真的英国在这件事情上面，他们在这个政策上面，他们在做法上面有很多非常值得我们去学习的。那当然，再怎么样大家都清楚，那台湾就像局长刚才那个提问非常的正确，台湾台北有自己的模式，我们有自己的条件，不可能那就是完全的去挪用过来。那所以说，总结来说，做就对了，因为这个方向做了之后，你完全不会后悔，因为我们在对后代负责任，怎么做都会是对的事情。谢谢各位。
好，非常谢谢刘维公前局长啊，非常精彩，我想他的确是一路思考这个问题。我们最后Fran 可不可以给一点小小的结论 ，make a conclusion？
Yeah, it's really reassuring to hear the resonance. And while listening to you, Pastor I wondered about whether I should have started earlier in the journey of impact investment. I think I feel very optimistic about the potential for this growing slice of capital to be more purpose-driven. I feel that very strongly with generational wealth transfer. And I feel like it's the same where there are parallels there is a lot of money. And if we can just shift the intention of that capital towards positive outcomes, there is a lot of good that can be done. I think that the key of the arts and culture creative sector is the imagination, the power of the models to capture the public imagination, the reach already into the general public with creative content and cultural brands. I'm already having ideas about more things we can do to sort of to perpetuate that sense that actually money can be productively engaged in creating good outcomes for individuals, communities, society, the planet.
OK, thank you. 好，非常谢谢今天我们第一个场次的2位国内外的专家给各位做的一些专题的报告。 非常希望哈，这是我们今天这个活动非常好的一个开始，但是还没有结束，待会还有第二场。好，谢谢。